There you have it. So this morning we're looking at the question, is Christianity too narrow? You heard some of the complaints, comments that are often voiced in our culture. It's just, how can you possibly think you've got a monopoly on truth, as one person said, for example. That's what we're talking about this morning. If you want to open up to Acts chapter 17, Acts 17, we'll be looking at verses 16 to 34. Now, as you're turning there, in 2004, filmmaker Theo van Gogh, a Dutch filmmaker, was killed by a Muslim radical in the Netherlands. And it led to a series of retaliatory attacks on mosques, on churches, and on schools even. And this shocked a Dutch community that prided itself on its peaceful tolerance. I mean, this is secular Europe. This is a haven of tolerance and understanding and mutual respect. And yet here was this violence plaguing the community as well. It draws out that problem of narrowness that we experience and that we see. It feels like too much religion, too much dogmatism, it's a bad thing. It leads to fanaticism, and that fanaticism can lead to, often does lead to, violence. And we see this around the globe. Now, I wouldn't want to make too much of the religious violence necessarily. I think there are places where there are religions that are clashing, but it's more a cultural issue. You look at Northern Ireland, for example. I'm not sure it's really Catholics and Protestants that are fighting. I'm pretty sure it's the Irish and the English that are against each other there. The Balkans would be another example. Albania, Serbia, clashing over the whole issue of Kosovo. I get most of my foreign affairs from watching soccer games, and so when they played each other a few years back in Euro qualifying, and an Albanian flew a drone into the stadium with a big flag that said ethnic Albania. Ethnic, not religious. We're not worried about whether Kosovo stays Muslim, we're worried about whether Kosovo stays Albanian. And so we can make maybe a little too much of the religious motivation behind this violence, but hey, the violence is still there and the narrowness is still there. That we are in a global society at this point. It's a diverse culture here in the U.S. especially. How do we navigate this? How do we address the narrowness? Would it be better for us to temper our beliefs, to coexist, as the bumper sticker has it, by maybe playing down some of our uniqueness in our thinking? Now, we are not the first society to deal with this. I know we like to think of ourselves as the first global society, but hey, this was a problem all the way back in Greco-Roman times also. Greco-Roman culture, every bit as diverse racially, ethnically, and religiously. And that's why we're going to look at the Apostle Paul's model in his engagement with this diverse culture. Now, certainly, the Apostle Paul was a radical, a fanatic, a dogmatist. I mean, he's writing dogma. Most of Christian dogma comes from him. Like the book of Romans is maybe the clearest articulation of it, and Paul wrote that. So can you have that sort of strong faith without a violent fanaticism, a strong faith with tolerance and respect and love? Let's look together. So we're going to look at it in kind of three scenes here, and in each case kind of draw out an implication, a truth about who we are, and a response that we can demonstrate. So first of all, we're all narrow. That's the truth, and so the response would be dialogue. Let's talk together. Let me read verses 16 to 21, and we'll draw this out. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. This was social media in the first century. There you go. So here we are. We're all narrow, so dialogue. Paul is in Athens. He's waiting for some friends to arrive, and it says that he is greatly distressed. That word is the word, we get paroxysm from this word. So you can see the sort of level of distress he's experiencing. This is a big emotion that he feels, and it's provoking a response in him. Now, what is the big emotion that he's feeling that provokes this response? It's love. So the distress that he feels is the distress that love produces. Imagine you had a loved one, for example, who was caught up in a substance addiction. You would be distressed because of your deep love for that family member. That's what Paul's feeling, and it's what motivates his evangelism, which is important for us to draw out, that proselytizing happens because of love. And this is not a uniquely Christian belief. We're not the only ones who would think this way. Here's Penn Jillette of the famous magicians duo, Penn and Teller. He is a staunch atheist. He has very little respect for Christianity as a worldview, but he said this at one point to his followers. He says, if you believe people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life, and you think that it's not really worth telling them this because it would make it socially awkward, and he turns and he says, and atheists who think people shouldn't proselytize and who say, just leave me alone and keep your religion to yourself, how much do you have to hate somebody to not proselytize? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? So here's Penn Jillette drawing out the fact that it is love that actually motivates it. He doesn't want to be evangelized. He doesn't think Christianity is right, and he's going, but I understand. I understand why you guys would do this. If you believed this were true, you would have to do this, or else it would be an expression of hatred. So in this case, that distress, it prompts Paul to do what? To reason, it says in verse 17, to reason with them. This is important. It's a point I've been trying to make throughout this series. We'll continue to make. We're not called to blind faith. We are not calling others to blind faith, but to reasonable faith. That word reason, by the way, in Greek it's dialegomai. You can almost hear in it. That's where our word dialogue comes from, which is why I've got dialogue as our takeaway from this. And we have dialogue recorded. There is a back and forth between Paul and his audience. Two groups in particular respond, Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. The Epicureans were material hedonists, material meaning they believed in matter. They did not believe in anything beyond matter. So they were atheists. They were naturalists, whatever you want to say, and hedonists. So you take what pleasure you can from this life by following Epicurean teaching, knowing that there's nothing else to it. And then there are the Stoics who are pantheists, maybe a little new agey if we wanted to put it in those terms. We're not going to get too deep into all that, though, because the piece I want us to see is that both groups already believe something, and believe it quite strongly. That's what I mean by everyone being narrow. We all already have beliefs, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we articulate them clearly or not. So these guys are staunch atheists. They're religious in their atheism or religious in their stoicism and philosophy. And you can see that in their response to Paul. What's this babble we're talking about? He's advocating strange ideas, foreign gods. So we already know the truth, and this guy's messing with it. That's the point I'm trying to draw out. All of us have a worldview. And we have a worldview because we think it's right. We think what we think because we think it's right. If we didn't think it was right, we wouldn't think it. There's your narrowness. Okay? There's your religion baked into who you are. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said there are two types of people in the world: those who have dogma and know it, and those who have dogma and don't know it. Everybody's got dogma. That's common to humanity. It's a question of whether or not we acknowledge it, recognize the dogma that we have, and recognize that in holding that sort of dogma, it makes us exclusivist, gives us a sense of superiority over people who don't agree with us. Again, we think we're right, which means if they don't agree, we think they're wrong. That's just how it works. So this is true of all of us. So let me give you just an example. Look at the argument that is used against religious dogmatism today. All religions are equally valid. It should be a private affair. Quit trying to convince other people. Just live and let live. First of all, that's just a raw assertion. It's just pure dogma. There's no evidence marshaled for this claim, and probably because it's a patently false claim. It's false. We talked about this week 1 a little bit, right? The religions contradict each other, so that statement can't possibly be true. Just as a quick example, Christians believe that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. Muslims believe that Jesus did not rise bodily from the dead. Look, one of us is right and one of us is wrong. We can't both be right unless we're just denying logic altogether, and that's going to be a dangerous place to be, I would think. So patently false, but more importantly for us this morning, it's also incredibly insulting to adherents of every religion. Good. I got an amen. This is nice. These Baptists, they're terrible. Like, I mean, a little feedback every now and again would be good here. Incredibly insulting to adherents of every religion. Usually you hear it, and I think we heard it expressed in the video even, at its core, every religion is basically the same. And usually that basically the same is secular liberalism. Like just the humanism sort of idea. We should just love each other more. By the way, at its core, that's not what any religion teaches. Like, so, all we have to do to get to that point for Christianity is to strip away the deity of Christ, his substitutionary death and resurrection. That's Christianity, okay? So long as you say Christianity is wrong, then yeah, at its core, it's just like whatever everybody else thinks, I guess. So you see the problem with this. Also, by the way, who thinks this? Who thinks that all religions are all the same? Western secularists, and no one else on the planet. You have to be white and Western to think this way, and probably have to be educated at a certain type of college. So this is an incredibly narrow view which espouses radical inclusivism. So it's got this cultural imperialism about it that is so interesting. If it's narrow and wrong to say there's one true religion, it is just as narrow and wrong to say that we should think about all religions in one way. Rebecca McCracken draws this out in a wonderful little blog post she had probably a year or so ago called 6 Cracks in the Secular Worldview. She writes this is one of the cracks that she's talking about. My secular friends celebrate religious diversity and uphold the rights of religious minorities to practice their faith. This is a beautiful instinct, completely agree. Christians have often been on the forefront of the fight for religious liberty. But then she goes on, she said, but what happens when religious beliefs clash with secular values? If we say to our Muslim friends, we uphold your right to be a Muslim, so long as you embrace equal roles for men and women, the legitimacy of same-sex marriage, and the freedom of your teenagers to experiment sexually, are we truly upholding their right to practice their faith? Of course not. Of course not. And she goes on to quote Nicholas Kristof, a writer for the New York Times, who is a secular humanist himself, but who is a little more open-minded to the question of religion than some of his ilk. And he writes this. He says, talking about secular humanists, we want to be inclusive of people who don't look like us, so long as they think like us. A rare admission of what goes on in this tribe. So we talk a big talk about tolerance, and we do as a nation and as a culture, but then inevitably insist that everybody agree with us or else we'll smear them. You see this politically, of course. Look, if you are on if you're a Republican, you're on the right, something like that, you look at the left, and what do you have? You have a bunch of cultural Marxists and social justice warriors, and neither one is meant to be a nice thing to say about the other person. But if you're on the left and you're looking at the right, you got narrow-minded bigots, racists, sexists, all of them, people who want Handmaid's Tale to be a documentary, that kind of thing. Do you see how in each case we are smearing the other person because they don't agree with us? That's the level of tolerance that we have in this culture. The solution is exactly what Paul does here. Dialogue. Actual two-way conversation with people where we admit that we have differences in our beliefs, show charity, and truly tolerate. And for true tolerance to exist, there has to be disagreement. The tolerance we have in our country today is, for the most part, we tolerate you so long as you get in line. There is a heresy, there's a heterodoxy that is unconscionable in so many parts of our country today. That's not what it is. That's not what Paul would recommend. Look at the response of at least some of Paul's interlocutors. Verse 19, they took him, brought him to a meeting, and they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. We want to hear more. This is confusing, this is different, and so we should listen. We need to talk a bit. And that's true for all of us, by the way. As Christians, in our evangelism, how many times have we said, okay, so you think I'm a nut job? Okay, I'd like to hear more about that. Like, go ahead. Like, tell me what your objections to Christianity are, what your issues are. We're not good at that as Christians. Can we acknowledge that? But then on the other side as well, some of you are here this morning because you got dragged here by somebody who's a Christian and they've been doing this whole proselytizing thing for a while now. Are you willing to say, okay, I don't think Christianity is right, but I'm willing to hear more? I hope that's why you're here this morning even. Lamin Sanneh, who's one of my favorite theologians, died just a few weeks ago, writing on this topic, one of my favorite theologians. What I love about him is, so he's a Gambian theologian who then taught at Yale for a number of years. Gambia, one of the smallest countries in Africa, a heavily Muslim country. So he's not only not Western, but is actually Islamic in his background. And so his perspective on Christianity and its relation to the world faiths is so interesting. He says this in his book, Whose Religion is Christianity? Disagreement is not a barrier to dialogue. On the contrary, it is a test of our willingness to presume on each other's goodwill and to covet the best for each other. That's the sort of dialogue that I would commend and that I think Paul is modeling. Let's press on, though. Next section, we're going to see we're all religious, and so our takeaway is going to be listen. So let me read verses 22 to 28. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. And God did this so that they would seek him, and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." So now that Paul has an invitation to speak, he's entered into this dialogue, he starts with what is common to humanity. He says, "I see that in every way you are very religious." In fact, the Athenians are so religious that they hedge their bets a bit and have this altar to, the God they might have just missed at some point. And so, hey, we're going to give him sacrifices too, just in case. This is important, by the way. This is the God that Socrates worshipped. He rejected the pagans and went, there's something beyond what I know. So this is an important altar that's there in Athens. But Paul sees the religious impulse behind it. He sees it also. He speaks of the temples, plural, that he sees in this city. And when we talk about temples here, we're not talking about like churches in Elmhurst. Like you got, First Presbyterian Temple of Zeus and First Baptist Temple of Zeus. Baptist, Presbyterian, both Greek words. You could find this in Athens. This would make sense. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about there's a temple of Zeus, and there's a temple of Artemis, and there's a temple of Bonadea, and there's a temple, and we could just go on and on and on. So we got all these gods represented in this city. So that's one expression of the deep religious impulse. And then he goes on to quote some of their philosophers, especially that last one. Some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. That's a poet, Aratus, who is a Stoic philosopher. So he's actually able to quote from this other religion that he's engaging with. But what does that mean? That means Aratus took the time to write down what he thinks about religion, and the Athenians are reading it. So there's this deep religious impulse again, and it's a religious impulse that is there within all of us. We are made to worship. And so we will worship something, whether we acknowledge it or not. David Foster Wallace, in a famous graduation speech that he gave at Harvard, if I remember correctly, a few years back, one of the most watched podcasts on all the internet, one of the most read articles, it's this right here. And he has this quote in the middle of this commencement address that he gives. He says, here's something else that's weird but true. The first weird but true thing that he was talking about was the fact that we're all deeply self-centered, which we've talked about a lot of times here. But here's something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. It's really interesting coming from somebody who is not religious, but recognizes that religious impulse in all of us, exactly what Paul sees. So we've got some options, and Wallace draws them out for us. We could worship something transcendent, divine, whatever that would look like, and we could name various gods, of course. Or we could worship something immanent, something material, something that's here in the natural world, something human. Something that we think, though, will bring us meaning and give our lives significance. Some of the prime candidates, and you can see this as you look around, like you can walk around your own Athens, you're going to see these same sorts of temples, even though they're not under the veneer of religion. You could see love, prime candidate. In fact, one writer recently referred to our approach to love these days as apocalyptic romance. The idea of the apocalyptic is, I need this love relationship to satisfy all of my needs. That's the sort of meaning I'm investing it with. That's a religious impulse. Achievement would be another option. You see this plenty. People are trying to climb the ladder, that sort of thing, to give themselves this significance. I think it was Sidney Pollack, the filmmaker, who said, every time I make a film, I feel like I've earned my stay for another year. That's a religious statement that he's making there. Or stuff, money, goods, all that. I read a fascinating article a few years back about how the Apple Store is actually designed to evoke feelings of transcendence. It's meant to look and feel like a temple. And by the way, it comes with its own priestly caste. They're called geniuses. So I applied. They said no. Andrew Delbanco, who's a Cornell sociologist, again, not a religious person. He would be a secular humanist as well. And he wrote this little book called The Real American Dream. Subtitle is A Meditation on Hope. And he talks about this same religious impulse and how it shows up in our nation's history. This is page 1 of the introduction. The premise of this book is that human beings need to organize the inchoate sensations amid which we pass our days, pain, desire, pleasure, fear, into a story. When that story leads somewhere and thereby helps us navigate through life to its inevitable terminus in death, it gives us hope. We must imagine some end to life that transcends our own tiny allotment of days and hours if we are to keep at bay the dim back-of-the-mind suspicion that one may be adrift in an absurd world, which we talked about quite a bit in week 1. But that's precisely what I mean by this religious impulse. And he's a sociologist, so he's studying culture at large and going, yeah, that's exactly what I see in our nation's history. People looking for explanation. People looking for coherence, people looking for significance and meaning and purpose, those sorts of things we talked about in week 1 when we looked at the question, does life have purpose? Now, where does this religious impulse come from? That's an interesting question. What's the source of this impulse? Different suggestions have been given. Some would suggest the psychological view, picture Freud here, of course, in that it is a question of our nature, a projection of our mind. So for Freud, he thought that God was basically a desire for our father figure. That's where it comes from. Freud, who was an atheist, nobody ever challenged him by saying, especially with all he wrote about the Oedipal complex, maybe his atheism was a projection of his desire to slay his father. But that's a separate question. Talk about it another day. There's the sociological source. That is my place in the world, my relationship to other people. And then there's the anthropological approach, which is that this is all myth. This is stories we invent to make sense of the world. Reduce it to its barest form, but we're scared of the dark, and so we got to come up with something. We're scared of death. But you see that each of those views draws out questions that we actually have, questions that we actually ask. It's why you're here this morning on a series about the questions we all ask, because we really do all ask them. Who am I? Where do I fit? How do I explain all that I see in this world? So even if you eliminate the transcendent, the religious piece, the supernatural piece, you still have to answer. Which is why if you read hardcore atheists, naturalists, biologists, physicists, people like that who approach nature from this terms, they end up capitalizing the word nature and speaking about nature in rapturous terms because there is this transcendence that has to come out somewhere. Exactly what Wallace was talking about. Now, why do I suggest that listen is the proper response to this impulse? Well, it's because of what happens in verse 23, the very end of it. You are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. So Paul is proclaiming something that addresses ignorance. Ignorance is a strong word for us. That's fairly insulting. But remember, ignorance and agnosticism, they've got the same root words in them. The sense of, well, I don't quite know. That's true of all of us, by the way. Some of us have settled beliefs, but we do not know with 100% certainty anything, probably, in life. And so Paul's going, I might be able to help you out here. If we're all going to worship, if that worship impulse is in all of us regardless, we're going to worship anyway, we have to be quite careful about what we worship. We need to get this right. This feels important. True, by the way, for Christians. I'm not trying to cheat here. Okay, but we need to be quite clear about this as well. If Christianity is wrong, we should abandon it. It has zero value if Jesus Christ did not live, die, and rise from the dead. And if you could also send me job openings that you're aware of, like I'm going to need a new career path, okay? So has zero value. We gotta investigate. We gotta see if this is true or not. These are not questions that we can answer based on what we like, how we feel at that moment. There are problems with that. One of them is that it assumes that self is the center of all meaning. That's a very dangerous place to live because in essence then you make yourself God. I get to decide what is true based on how I feel at that moment. Even if it's culture that's shaping those viewpoints, I'm still the one who decides. I got issues with making myself God. If you're comfortable with that, okay. That's one expression of a religious impulse. I don't think it's the right one, but hey, whatever. It's not questions we answer based on what we like. It's questions we answer based on what is true. That's the question that matters. Is this true? And if someone thinks they know truth, it is worth listening. And all of us, across the board, not talking to one group of people here, it's worth listening. So let's turn then, last section, as we start to listen to Paul and what he has to say. We read verses 29 to 34. I'm going to have to draw this out. You're not going to see this quite as obviously as some of the other ones, but the point here that we're going to see is that we are all invited. And the takeaway is investigate. Investigate. So let me read. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So here we've got a group of people willing to listen, which is commendable on their part. And so Paul proclaims. What happens as he begins proclaiming about Christianity? Some sneer, and too narrow to consider an alternative, which I kind of understand. It's the resurrection that's the stumbling block, and the resurrection is weird. Yeah? When you read on that? Miracles are a huge stumbling block for us because we don't see a lot of them, and so anytime you're hearing about miracles, you're going, this doesn't feel quite as rational as I would like it to be. So some sneer. By the way, we're coming back to the resurrection next week. So we got to hang. That's a big question for us. If the resurrection actually happened, that suggests Christianity is probably true. So we're going to need to investigate that one carefully. Some sneer, but others are curious. We want to hear you again, verse 32. What are they doing? They are investigating. They are considering the claims that Paul is making. And this is important and, again, commendable. Now, at this point, I want to talk through Christianity specifically for a bit. We've been hitting just religion generally. I'm going to zero in on Christianity because that's what we're investigating here in this series. It's also what Paul is proclaiming. The question, after all, that we got before us this morning is, isn't Christianity too narrow? Doesn't it produce things like the Crusades, the Inquisition, even what happened in the Netherlands? The answer is it does, and it shouldn't. It does, in that Christianity reminds us that we are sinners in our nature, and we have plenty of people who profess Christ and who do wicked things. We would expect nothing less if we were to read the Bible cover to cover, but it shouldn't produce that. It should produce something else. Christianity, as Paul is going to explain, strikes this balance between absolute inclusion and hateful exclusion. Now, absolute inclusion is impossible. Now, none of us lives that way. Nobody says, whatever you think is fine. First of all, we're all too narrow to do that. So we've got, like, I know a guy, a Facebook friend, and he is an incredibly open-minded person. Again, not real happy with Christians for proselytizing all that stuff, until people were calling dibs on parking spots this week downtown. And then he had religious beliefs, and they came out. Dogmatically, I might add. So that sort of absolute inclusion is impossible and would be wrong-headed anyway. There are things we know we should not accept. Like if you're like, my religion is based on torturing babies, you go, nope, not inclusive. Sorry. Like, I'm going to exclude that as a... So absolute inclusion is impossible. But it doesn't mean then that we're only left with a hateful exclusion. There's got to be another possibility. And that's what Paul's going to talk about. In essence, what we're going to see here is that the gospel, the Christian message, is the most inclusive message in the world because it is the most exclusive message in the world. Good, paradox. We love that stuff. Now I got you curious at least, so you'll listen to me for a little bit longer. All right, so how does this work out? The inclusive part happens with this main takeaway that we've got here. All are invited, which is certainly a part of Christianity. It's interesting. The very first time the gospel message is proclaimed, on the day of Pentecost, after Christ's death and resurrection and ascension, it is proclaimed simultaneously in all the known languages of the world. It's interesting even that Christianity arises at this midpoint between Africa, Asia, and Europe, where it's got the most obvious reach into all cultures, but it is because it's preached in tongues the first time out. People are hearing it in their own native language from the get-go. And so from the beginning of Christianity, no language or culture has been preeminent. This continues today, by the way. It's quite clear that there are more languages used in Christian prayer, worship, and study than any other religion, by a long shot, not even close. In fact, Christians have been responsible for writing down most of the languages in the world because we're so committed to the Christian message being communicated in the vernacular, in each person's language. Now, just compare that to Islam. I'm not saying that this is wrong and we're right, but it's an interesting comparison. You cannot truly read the Quran except in Arabic. What does that mean then? Well, that's going to lead to a unified culture, which of course you'll see with Islam much more. Christianity does not involve conformity to a single culture. It is, in that way, unique among world religions. Just look at the stats. I've shared these before. 96% of Muslims live in the Middle East. Right? I mean, you're just going to draw a circle. Yep, that's where Muslims live. 88% of Buddhists live in Southeast Asia. 98% of Hindus live in India, Nepal, other parts of South Asia. And secularism, as I've said before. Secularism, I don't have the stats exactly, but it is a white Western philosophy. You're going to find it in Paris and London and New York City and places like that. But compare Christianity then. Where do Christians live? 25% live in Central and South America. 22% live in Africa. 15% in Asia. 12% in North America. 26% in Europe. It is the only truly worldwide religion. Why is that? I mean, that's interesting. We should explain that. It's an interesting fact. And it's because Christianity both challenges and accepts every culture. And again, Lamin Sanneh has done some tremendous work here. Look, we see it in our story this morning. So Paul confronts the Stoic culture, the Stoic worldview, and he says, you're right. I can even quote one of your prophets, one of your philosophers. You're right. But let me show you the implications. You are right that we're all God's offspring. But let me show you what that would mean for us. That means we don't need to give him anything because he made us. We belong to him. He doesn't need us in any way. Or take the example that Lamin Sanneh himself shares of a white European secularist coming across an African and the conversation that they would have. And what would happen? The Africans say, in Africa, we believe in spirits. It's a power, really, and we're trying to control the forces that are all around us. How's the secularist going to respond? We love you. We love your culture. We're really big into your food. Also, you're an idiot. You're not going to say it like that, but that's what's going to be said. There are no spirits. People who think there are spirits and powers of darkness and good are dumb. You should go to college so you learn better than that. So, let's say there's a Christian there who's watching this conversation unfold. What would the Christian be able to say, both to the African and to the white secularist? To the African, the Christian would be able to say, no, you are right. There are spirits. There are forces beyond what we can see with our eyes, but let me show you the one who conquered those spirits, the one who has all power. And in this way, as Sana says, I'm quoting him here at this point, the Christian would allow this person to become a renewed African instead of a remade European. But then to the European, the Christian could say, look, you're right too. It is good to use your brain. We are built to be rational creatures, but let me show you what true rationality and logic look like. And we can proclaim the Word who became flesh. The word is logos, logic. It was an important term for Greek philosophers. It had to do with the theory of everything. How do we explain the world in which we live? Thinkers today understand that we define ourselves by excluding others, as we establish an identity by barriers, in essence. We give all sorts of examples. I think we see this. But we feel self-worth by excluding others, then, who don't measure up. That's how we bolster our self-esteem. So people don't think the same or who don't follow the same God. We devalue them, other races, other beliefs, other traits, whatever it is that we're clinging to that we've invested with religious meaning. But Christians define themselves by identifying with the one who was excluded for us. That is a radical difference. Christ was cast out. He was forsaken by God and crucified outside the city gate. So he's actually been removed from the community. By identifying with him, we find our truest identity. That humbles us more deeply than mere religion can, and affirms us more powerfully than mere religion can. I can't despise anyone just because they're different, because they're not measuring up, because Christ should have despised me, because I didn't measure up. And that's actually what Paul even draws out. He's set a day when he will judge the world. He's going to judge us because we do not measure up. Not one of us measures up. That's important. But so think then of what that knowledge does to your sense of religious superiority. I'm here, I'm accepted in the presence of God, not because of me, but because of him, because of what he has done in my place. Really difficult to look down on somebody who isn't performing up to standards when you didn't perform up to standards either. Again, we typically feel disdainful of those who are not following the true path, and so we dismiss them as being immoral, or we dismiss them as being narrow-minded bigots because the true path involves tolerance and inclusion. But not with the gospel. Not with the gospel. It's something totally different. This is illustrated, like almost all important spiritual truths, in the Lord of the Rings. Where do we see it in the Lord of the Rings? Gimli, that dwarf and representative of the dwarves in this story, is deeply distrustful of elves. If you don't know this, dwarves and elves don't like each other. Okay, we've got some racial animosity here. Until Gimli meets Galadriel, the Lady of Lorien, who speaks to him in his own language. That's important. We've already talked about the language piece. Also important because dwarves don't teach people their language, don't teach elves their language, so where'd she learn this? So speaks to him in his language and with love. What happens? Let me quote Tolkien at this point. And the dwarf, hearing the names given in his own ancient tongue, looked up and met her eyes, and it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw their love and understanding. Wonder came into his face, and then he smiled in answer. And you know, if you've seen the movies, read the books, his attitude towards elves shifts, and he becomes good friends with Legolas, one of the elves at that point. Why? He was embraced in love by the other when he was expecting hatred, and it allowed him to embrace others who are different. Precisely what Jesus asks of us when he tells us to love our enemies. Because when we look into the heart of God, we expect to see an enemy because we have not measured up and we are in rebellion against him, and instead we see love and understanding displayed supremely in the cross of Christ. Because we were welcomed by the one who is wholly other, we ourselves can welcome others. So Christianity, the most inclusive worldview, all are welcome, regardless of culture and despite the fact that we don't measure up. So it can be the most inclusive because it's the most exclusive. And what I mean by that, the most exclusive, is because it excludes all of us. You're not good enough. None of you are good enough. I'm also not good enough. Nobody can do it. None of us rate. And this is the huge difference between Christianity and other world religions. Other founders of religious traditions, thinking of guys like Muhammad and Buddha, would say, here is the way. Follow the Eightfold Path. Keep the 5 pillars of Islam. And then we get in the secular humanist worldview, they're different paths, but kind of up the same mountain, and we sort of all get to the top together. And so anyone who can climb will rate, will make it, that sort of thing. And that's going to lead to feelings of superiority. Like, I'm literally higher up the mountain than you are. I've climbed farther. I'm doing a better job than you are. You're going the wrong way, in fact. That will lead to feelings of superiority. I pray better. I read the right book. And this is true even in secularism. I'm more altruistic. I'm more open-minded. But Jesus does something totally different than the founders of the other religions. He says, not, I'm here to show you how to find God. He says, I'm God, and I'm here to find you. That's a big claim, by the way. That whole Jesus being God thing, like that's a sticking point. Guess what? Next week's topic. Awesome. I'll see you back here then. All right? Let's dive in on this one. Because again, if Jesus is God, that does kind of change things. So we should probably hear more about that. We'll have a good Athenian perspective. But what does that do? The whole idea that Jesus is saying, I'm God and I'm here to find you. It shatters our performance mindset. Shatters it. It overcomes that sense of us versus them, because we're all them. We're all the excluded other apart from Christ. And it leads to this inclusive invitation to the excluded other. We are all welcome if we come through Christ. Now, is this just a pipe dream? And that's kind of the last bit we got to look at here. Is this just a fairy tale idea that the gospel would actually transform us like this? What about all the superior Christians that I know? The guys who are hatefully exclusive. And yeah, I know them too. Now, the issue, of course, is not that they're too fanatical about Christianity. It's that they're not nearly fanatical enough about Christianity. They have not understood the gospel. They've understood something that they've made themselves. What happens when we actually work out the implications of the gospel in our own lives? Well, let's head back to the Netherlands for a moment. Let's finish up the story that I started telling at the beginning. So the churches, mosques, religious schools being bombed. The country is reeling at this point, and in steps a Dutch Protestant minister named Kees Sybrandy. He's a conservative Christian, narrow-minded, bigoted, those sorts of things, living in a neighborhood, by the way, where an influx of Muslim immigrants had brought crime and poverty. So he would be somebody who has actually got reason to disdain this new group, the other that has come into his community. What does he do, though? One night, in the midst of all this violence, he walks to his neighborhood mosque, knocks on the door, and tells the confused and terrified Muslims huddling inside that he would stand guard all that night and every night until the bombings stop. And then he began to call on other church leaders in the area to do the same. And the Christians in this region, not city, but region, began circling mosques every night for 3 months until the bombings actually did stop. Now, an interviewer asked why. This Dutch newspaper, and they're figuring, I probably know why based on my secular humanism. And so it had to be some experience in his life. Right? Once you get to know a Muslim personally, you could never look at them the same way. And Sybrandy said, nope, I don't have any Muslim friends. I don't know anyone well enough for that. Have done. Well, then clearly it's the fact that you grew up in the Netherlands. We're this tolerant, pluralistic society. That's what did it, isn't it? You get these secular liberal values. No, they have no pull on me. Which makes sense, by the way. We're generally unwilling to risk our own lives for the sake of something like diversity. It just isn't a powerful enough pull. We're not going to count the cost for that. So why? Why, they asked him. Why would a traditional, conservative, narrow-minded, why would he step out of his hate-filled bigotry and narrow-mindedness and into this sort of radical inclusivism? And he said this, Jesus commanded me to love my neighbor and even my enemy too. It was as simple as that. That's the power of the gospel at work. Reminds us, radically exclusive, yes, more exclusive than any worldview on the planet, but radically inclusive as well. And if we follow its implications, allow them to work themselves out in our hearts, we will become the most loving people on the planet, despite our dogmatic beliefs. That's my prayer for us. Let's in fact turn to prayer at this time. Lord, we recognize that we do not rate. We are not superior. We are, like everyone else on the planet, in the same predicament, deserving of the judgment, just judgment that we know is coming, because we have rebelled against you. in our sin and self-centeredness. We have failed to love as radically as you taught us because we are so centered on ourselves. And if it were up to us, not one of us would make it. Not one of us would rate. But thanks be to God, it was not up to us. And you have made a way for us. Indeed, you became the way for us when you became flesh, Jesus Christ of Nazareth. When you were excluded that we might be included. You were forsaken in our place that we might be welcomed in yours, embraced as your children. Lord, may that message transform us. Whether we have believed for decades or are considering these claims even still, let that message work itself deep into our hearts and transform us from the inside out. We pray through Christ our Lord. Amen.